hot August night in 1856, Reverend Elias Thornfield vanished from his locked study in Charleston's prestigious church, leaving behind a blood-stained Bible and a cryptic note that read, "The congregation demands its sacrifice. The covenant must be honored." For over a century, the Charleston diocese kept the true circumstances of his disappearance buried. But recently uncovered letters revealed a conspiracy so shocking it shook Southern society. Thornfield, who had preached to senators and slave owners, was caught in a web of corruption and deadly ambition that reached Charleston's elite. The investigation that followed was sabotaged. Witnesses died or disappeared mysteriously, and evidence was destroyed by powerful families. The truth would expose a network of corruption involving federal senators, Supreme Court justices, and banking dynasties, still influential in Charleston today. In 1856, Charleston was the heart of the antebellum South. Its wealthy families controlled rice, cotton, and slavery, creating a society where reputation meant everything. The smell of jasmine couldn't mask the misery of the slave markets, while St. Bartholomew's Church stood tall, funded by the city's elite, the Ravenels, the Pinckneys, and the Rats. Inside business deals were made, marriages arranged, and secrets buried deep. Reverend Thornfield had arrived from Richmond 3 years earlier with glowing credentials and a reputation for scholarly brilliance and charm. His previous position had ended mysteriously, and rumors of a scandal followed him. At 38, he was a towering figure with striking blue eyes and silver hair, delivering sermons that captivated Charleston's powerful men and women. His charisma made him the confidant of the city's elite, who entrusted him with their darkest secrets in the privacy of his study. Dr. Edmund Rutledge, a respected physician and descendant of a prominent South Carolina family, was one of Reverend Thornfield's most frequent visitors. Rutledge controlled several profitable businesses, including a discreet establishment on Magnolia Street for wealthy gentlemen. His wife Margaret remained unaware of his diverse ventures. Judge Hamilton Crenshaw, known for his incorruptible reputation in the courtroom, was another regular at Thornfield's study. Though his decisions were revered, Crenshaw secretly battled gambling debts that threatened his family's fortune. Senator Robert Barnwell, a powerful advocate for Southern interests, also frequented the church, always alone and with the air of a man hiding dark secrets. Barnwell's political career relied on maintaining a spotless reputation, yet whispers around Charleston suggested his rise to power involved unspeakable compromises. The summer of 1856 was particularly oppressive, with yellow fever and political tensions over slavery expansion weighing heavily on Charleston. The atmosphere was thick with fear, and people spoke of omens and portents. On August 23rd, the city felt suffocating as the heat reached 98 degrees. The usually busy Market Street grew quiet as residents sought refuge from the sun. Thornfield spent the morning in his study preparing for Vespers and meeting with parishioners. Sarah Beaumont, the church secretary, noticed his distraction as he repeatedly checked a gold pocket watch he'd received from a mysterious benefactor the previous Christmas. The watch bore an undecipherable Latin inscription, and Sarah observed Thornfield often caressing it in deep thought. Throughout the day, Charleston's elite visited St. Bartholomew's Church, each seeking private meetings with Reverend Thornfield. Sarah noticed these sessions were different from his usual pastoral counseling. The visitors appeared anxious and left even more disturbed. Cornelius Fitzhugh, a prominent tobacco merchant, left one such meeting visibly shaken, unable to even light his cigar. As the sun set over the churchyard filled with graves of Charleston's founding families, Thornfield dismissed Sarah earlier than usual. He insisted she lock the doors and not let anyone disturb him, citing urgent matters. His voice trembled with an unfamiliar anxiety, unsettling Sarah. Having worked at the church long enough, Sarah could tell something was wrong. Thornfield, usually calm and composed, was agitated, his hands shaking as he sorted papers. Most troubling, he spent minutes staring at a daguerreotype of 13 men around an altar which he kept locked in his desk drawer. At 7:30, as the city's bells tolled for evening prayers, 3 men arrived at the church: Dr. Rutledge, Judge Crenshaw, and Cornelius Fitzhugh. These powerful vestry members entered the church with reluctance, their faces twisted with fear and determination, their usual confidence replaced by anxiety. They hurried into Thornfield's study without acknowledging Sarah. The door shut with a finality that echoed throughout the church. For the next hour and a half, Sarah heard heated conversation punctuated by raised voices. At one point, she clearly heard Dr. Rutledge shout, "You cannot ask this of us, Elias, not after everything we've built." Thornfield's cold reply chilled her. "Covenant demands completion, and your souls are already forfeit." The conversation grew more intense, with Fitzhugh joining in, suggesting they claim the deaths from yellow fever. Thornfield rejected this, insisting the covenant demanded a specific sacrifice. There would be no substitutions or delays. At 9:15, the study door opened, and the 3 men emerged, their faces pale and their movements shaky. Judge Crenshaw's hands trembled so violently that he struggled to light his pipe, dropping several matches before finally managing a faint flame. Fitzhugh kept glancing back toward the study, as if expecting something terrible to emerge, repeatedly making the sign of the cross in a protective gesture. Dr. Rutledge, though trying to maintain composure, was visibly sweating, and his clothes, usually immaculate, were now disheveled. "Miss Beaumont," he said, his voice controlled but shaking beneath the surface. "Reverend Thornfield is working late on spiritual matters. He requests no disturbances. You should go home and make sure no one enters the church until morning service." His tone brooked no argument, but Sarah noticed his eyes avoided hers, and his words seemed rehearsed. As the men departed into the Charleston night, the sound of their carriage wheels echoed on the cobblestones, leaving an oppressive sense of dread hanging over the church. The flickering gas lamps cast eerie shadows across the Gothic arches, making the religious frescoes seem almost alive in their ominous movement. Sarah waited, growing more anxious by the minute, before finally gathering the courage to check on Thornfield. The study door remained locked, but light seeped from beneath it, accompanied by the sound of pages turning and a scratching pen. Occasionally she heard what could have been a prayer in a language she didn't recognize, something darker than Latin or English, sending chills down her spine. Pressing her ear to the door, she heard Thornfield's voice rising and falling in what seemed like an incantation, interrupted by long silences. At one point she thought she heard other voices responding, though she knew Thornfield was alone. The air near the door grew unnaturally cold, as if drawing all warmth from the surrounding space. Something was terribly wrong. The next morning, Sarah arrived for service preparations, only to find the study still locked with no response to her frantic knocking. The sexton Marcus Webb, who had keys to every door in the church, was summoned. After decades of service, nothing could have prepared him for what awaited behind that heavy oak door. The study was empty, but what they found would haunt Charleston for generations and drive both Sarah and Marcus to their graves with secrets too dreadful to share. Reverend Thornfield had vanished without a trace, as though he had never existed. The windows were locked from the inside, the heavy shutters securely latched, and the door, though locked from within, was the only entry point, with the key lying on the desk. What greeted them was unimaginable. Thornfield's Bible lay open on the desk, its pages stained with fresh blood that hadn't dried, forming deliberate patterns over passages on sacrifice, covenant, and the cost of spiritual power. Beside it, a note in Thornfield's unmistakable handwriting, written in the same dark red ink, read, "The congregation demands its sacrifice. The covenant must be honored. The 13 have become 12, but the work continues. E." The room itself showed signs of ritual. Drawers were neatly emptied, their contents arranged in piles on the carpet, letters by date, financial records by category, and most unsettling sealed envelopes bearing the names of Charleston's elite arranged in a perfect circle around the chair. In the center of the circle was a dark blood stain, far too large to be anything but a deliberate ritual. Behind the desk, ceremonial items were laid out, an ornate dagger with strange symbols carved into its handle stained with the same dark blood, and a silver chalice from the church's communion service. The room bore the unmistakable signs of a ritual with blood and strange symbols marking nearly every surface. The investigation that followed was swift, obstructed, and manipulated. Judge Crenshaw led the inquiry, deeming the situation too delicate to investigate fully, while Dr. Rutledge served as the medical examiner, despite the clear conflict of interest and lack of a body. The official conclusion was a mental breakdown caused by heat and stress, with Thornfield's disappearance attributed to a family emergency in Virginia. The media reported that Thornfield had left to attend to his dying mother with his belongings to follow and a replacement arranged. However, those close to the investigation knew the truth was far darker. Marcus Webb, shaken by what he had seen, whispered to his wife that the vestry members were terrified in the days following Thornfield's disappearance. Dr. Rutledge appeared to age a decade within a week. The horror that had unfolded in the study was a secret too dangerous to expose, and Charleston would never be the same. In the aftermath of Reverend Thornfield's disappearance, the lives of those involved were irrevocably changed. Judge Crenshaw, once dignified, began drinking heavily. Often seen stumbling out of taverns on East Bay Street, muttering about prices paid and covenants honored. Dr. Rutledge's hair turned gray almost overnight, and despite his previous stature, he abruptly sold his medical practice and left Charleston, citing his wife's fragile health. He sold his properties at significant losses, leaving behind valuable personal belongings. Most strikingly, all three men who had met with Thornfield the night he vanished fled Charleston. Judge Crenshaw, after 25 years on the bench, announced his sudden retirement, citing exhaustion and a desire for quiet contemplation in Georgia. His departure left the legal system in chaos for months. Cornelius Fitzhugh, whose tobacco business had been worth hundreds of thousands, sold it at a fraction of its value and vanished, with rumors pointing to California or South America. His wife and children were left to deal with his sudden disappearance and unanswered questions. Sarah Beaumont, deeply shaken by the events, was encouraged to take a leave of absence. When she tried to return after a month, she found her position had been filled by a young woman from Columbia who was instructed never to ask about the previous secretary or the church's recent history. In the months that followed, strange occurrences plagued St. Bartholomew and the surrounding neighborhood. The new Reverend Jonathan Pierce reported feeling watched during his sermons, and strange cold spots appeared in Thornfield's former study. Parishioners reported eerie experiences during services, such as whispered conversations from empty pews and the unsettling sensation of someone standing behind them during prayers. Some even felt breath on their necks, though no one was there. The church's financial records grew even more mysterious, with anonymous donations arriving every month, always in the exact amount of Thornfield's former salary. The cash came with notes written in an unidentifiable handwriting, resembling Thornfield's distinct script. The truth about Thornfield's disappearance remained hidden for decades, protected by a conspiracy that spanned from Charleston's elite to the halls of Congress. But secrets, no matter how buried, have a way of resurfacing, especially when they involve sins that taint bloodlines and curse families for generations. In the winter of 1889, 33 years after that fateful August night, a renovation project at the Rutledge family mansion would inadvertently expose horrors that had been buried for decades. While workers were conducting renovations on the prestigious South Battery property, they discovered a hidden compartment behind a false wall in Dr. Edmund Rutledge's private study. This concealed space had gone unnoticed, even during previous renovations and the sale of the house after Rutledge's death in 1871. Inside carefully preserved documents wrapped in oilcloth were found documents that could have destroyed Charleston's elite in 1856 and still posed a threat to their descendants. The papers contained correspondence, financial records, and most damning of all, photographs of activities that violated not only South Carolina's laws, but the very moral fabric of Southern society. The documents revealed that Reverend Elias Thornfield had been more than just an ambitious clergyman. He had masterminded an intricate web of blackmail, extortion, and conspiracy stretching from Charleston to Richmond, Washington, and New Orleans, involving some of the most powerful men in the antebellum South. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a letter dated August 15, 1856, just days before Thornfield's disappearance. It was addressed to Dr. Rutledge and exposed the true nature of their relationship. "My dear Edmund, your continued resistance to our arrangement is both disappointing and dangerous to all concerned." The letter read, "The photographic evidence I possess of your activities at the Magnolia Street establishment would ruin your medical reputation and likely cause your wife Margaret's delicate constitution to collapse. Moreover, the documentation of your involvement in the illegal opium trade will result in federal charges and life imprisonment. Senator Barnwell has agreed to our terms regarding federal land in the territories. Judge Crenshaw understands the consequences of refusing to ensure favorable verdicts in the Morrison slave uprising trials. I trust you will reconsider your position on the yellow fever medication supplies. The Lord's work requires sacrifice, and the covenant demands completion. Your eternal soul, along with those of your fellow participants, hangs in the balance at." The letter unveiled not only Thornfield's blackmail operation, but hinted at a far more sinister spiritual or occult covenant binding his victims to him. The references to eternal souls and completion suggested Thornfield believed he was part of something much larger than mere extortion. Another discovery was even more revealing: a leather-bound ledger listing the names of over 40 Charleston luminaries, detailing their crimes and the prices they paid to keep their secrets. The entries read like a catalog of depravity: BR, our cotton futures manipulation, 500-month HC jury tampering, protection for 300-month AQ acquittal guarantees for slave trafficking, ongoing protection. The ledger also revealed that the money Thornfield collected was being funneled into something called the Sacred Works Fund for ritual materials, ceremonial requirements, and most disturbingly, acquisition costs for participants in the covenant. Tucked between the pages was a membership roster for the Covenant of Solomon, with 13 names listed, including Thornfield's own as High Priest and Master of Ceremonies. The other names included Dr. Rutledge, Judge Crenshaw, and Cornelius Fitzhugh, along with even more shocking participants: Senator Robert Barnwell, Federal Judge William Manning, and Charleston Mayor Patrick Hennessy. These revelations rocked the foundations of Charleston's elite, exposing a conspiracy that had long remained hidden in the shadows. Beneath the names in the roster was a chilling motto written in both English and what appeared to be Hebrew: "Through sacrifice we achieve dominion. Through dominion we achieve immortality. Through immortality we transcend the laws of God and man." The roster, dated 1854, just 2 years after Thornfield's arrival in Charleston, suggested he had spent considerable time recruiting his participants into whatever dark purpose he had devised. Each name was accompanied by a date and cryptic notations such as "Confession of the Morrison Affair" or "Bound through evidence of the federal contract fraud," indicating that Thornfield had methodically collected and exploited the secrets of Charleston's powerful men, drawing them into his covenant with promises of power and salvation. One of the most unsettling documents was a detailed floor plan of Charleston's old slave market, marked with specific chambers designated for what were described as covenant rituals and sacred works. The plan revealed an underground network of chambers beneath the market areas, modified for purposes far removed from the legal slave trade. Dates between 1854 and 1856 were penciled into the margins, detailing ceremonies and covenant obligations, with the last entry dated August 20th, 1856, just 3 days before Thornfield's disappearance, reading, "Final sacrifice prepared, covenant completion scheduled. The master's hour approaches. Martha Rutledge, Dr. Edmund's granddaughter, inherited the mansion, and along with it the burden of her family's dark history. In her 60s, Martha had grown up hearing whispers about her grandfather's withdrawal from Charleston society and his so-called religious contemplation. Upon discovering the truth, she understood the source of the family's nightmares. With trembling hands, she brought the documents to her attorney, Charles Pitton. Pitton, a man known for his discretion and dealing with Charleston's elite families, was shocked by what he saw. After 3 days of reviewing the papers, he advised Martha to destroy them immediately and never speak of them again. "Some secrets," he said, his voice grave, "are too dangerous to resurrect. Your grandfather and his associates are long dead, their victims beyond justice, their crimes beyond redemption. Let their sins die with them." But Martha, possessing a moral courage her grandfather lacked, insisted the documents be preserved for future generations. She transferred them to the Charleston Historical Society with the stipulation that they remain sealed for 50 years, believing the truth must eventually come to light. What Martha didn't know was that her decision would set in motion a series of discoveries that would uncover the full scope of the conspiracy. In 1893, 4 years after Martha's discovery, construction workers demolishing the site of Charleston's old slave market unearthed physical evidence that corroborated the most disturbing implications of the documents. The market closed since 1863 and left to deteriorate for 30 years had been built on top of a much larger complex. Beneath the main floor was a vast network of underground chambers carved from native stone and bricked to create rooms with no resemblance to storage areas. These hidden chambers, designed for purposes unknown to the public, would confirm the darkest of suspicions that the conspiracy Thornfield had started had festered beneath Charleston streets, infecting its elite like a spiritual plague. The underground chambers revealed disturbing signs of recent use, despite the market's closure 3 decades earlier. The walls were stained with blood, much more than what might be expected from an accident. These stains spoke of deliberate violence. Iron shackles still hung from rings bolted into the stone, their surfaces worn smooth from the struggles of countless victims. But it was the discovery of personal items in the deepest chamber that confirmed the worst fears raised by the Rutledge documents. Among the recovered items were a gold pocket watch engraved with the initials E.T. and the Latin inscription Tempus Mortis, time of death. The watch was immediately recognized by elderly parishioners as the one Reverend Thornfield had consulted obsessively in his final days. A silver communion cup bearing the seal of St. Bartholomew's Church was also found. Its surface stained with substances the medical examiner would not identify in his official report. But the most chilling discovery was a collection of daguerreotype photographs showing 13 men in ceremonial robes standing around an altar constructed from human bones. The city's response was swift, coordinated at the highest levels. Mayor Thomas Bennett, whose own name appeared in the Rutledge documents, ordered the chambers to be filled with concrete before a detailed investigation could take place. Construction proceeded on an accelerated schedule, and within 6 months, the new Charleston Municipal Building stood on top of whatever secrets had been buried beneath. However, the construction workers had not been sworn to secrecy. Rumors began circulating quickly through Charleston's working-class neighborhoods, spreading like wildfire. The stories grew wilder and more detailed with each telling as men who had worked in the chambers shared their terrifying experiences with their wives, who whispered to neighbors until the entire city buzzed with horror. Thomas McKenna, an Irish stoneworker who had helped excavate the chambers, began drinking heavily, spending his wages in taverns along the waterfront. He would regale anyone who would listen with wild accounts of what he had seen. McKenna, a man who had worked in construction in Boston and New York, claimed that nothing compared to the evil practiced in those underground rooms. 13 bodies, he would whisper, his voice slurred with whiskey and terror. 13 poor souls, black and white alike, arranged in a perfect circle around that damned altar like they was in some kind of prayer meeting. But this wasn't no Christian gathering. I can tell you that. The way they was positioned, the things done to them before they died, it was like something from the depths of hell. McKenna's accounts might have been dismissed as the ramblings of a drunk, but one disturbing detail connected his claims to the Rutledge documents. He insisted that the bodies were arranged in a specific pattern, with 12 victims forming a circle around a 13th figure dressed in the black robes of a clergyman. But here's the thing that'll haunt me to my grave. McKenna would continue lowering his voice to a whisper. That preacher in the center, he wasn't killed like the others. No, sir. That devil died with a smile on his face, his hands folded in prayer like he was welcoming whatever dark angel came to take him. And the knife, Jesus preserve us. The knife was still in his own hands. McKenna's chilling description seemed to align perfectly with the membership roster found among Dr. Rutledge's papers. 13 men, including Thornfield, who formed the Covenant of Solomon. But McKenna's account suggested something even darker than mass murder. Thornfield, it seemed, had orchestrated his own death as the ultimate sacrifice in whatever malevolent pact he had made with forces beyond comprehension. The implications of this discovery were staggering, far beyond a simple murder or suicide. Had Thornfield convinced 12 of Charleston's most powerful men to participate in his ritual death? Were they willing accomplices in his final ceremony? Or had they been manipulated into becoming victims in a twisted culmination of years of blackmail? If the underground chambers indeed contained evidence of systematic murders spanning years, how many of Charleston's missing slaves and impoverished whites had truly fallen prey to the Covenant's horrific rituals? As word of McKenna's claims spread through Charleston's underground networks, servants, dock workers, and free blacks who had long suspected the sinister truths hidden beneath the city's genteel facade, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Church records from St. Bartholomew's, starting in 1854, the same year the Covenant of Solomon was formed, showed substantial donations for what was described as a special ministry to Charleston's marginalized population. This ministry, overseen by Thornfield and administered by Dr. Rutledge, Judge Crenshaw, and Cornelius Fitzhugh, claimed to provide aid to runaway slaves, destitute immigrants, and others on the fringes of Charleston society. The record suggested a well-organized operation, providing housing, food, and spiritual guidance. However, city records painted a far darker picture. During the same period that St. Bartholomew was supposedly helping the city's most vulnerable, disappearances among these groups surged. Police reports documented dozens of cases of missing persons, mostly runaway slaves. Irish immigrants, free blacks, and poor whites, all individuals whose disappearances would not disrupt Charleston's social order. Most unnervingly, many of these missing persons had been seen in the company of well-dressed gentlemen claiming to represent charitable organizations. Witnesses described these men as refined, educated, and authoritative qualities that matched those of Charleston's elite, including members of Thornfield's Covenant. The pattern became even more disturbing when these disappearances were cross-referenced with Thornfield's ritual calendar. Each disappearance coincided with a date marked as a covenant obligation or sacred work, suggesting that the missing individuals were specifically selected for the ceremonies held in the underground chambers. Dr. Magnus Steinberg, a German physician who had immigrated to Charleston in 1855, grew increasingly concerned about the growing number of disappearances. In letters to his brother in Hamburg, he wrote that he suspected something far more sinister than random crime was behind the vanishings. The missing persons share characteristics that suggest deliberate selection, he wrote in December 1855. They are healthy young and have no social connections that would trigger extensive searches. More troubling still, several patients seeking my services reported being approached by representatives of charitable organizations I cannot verify as existing. I fear that Charleston's facade of Christian charity hides appetites far darker than mere greed or lust. Steinberg's concerns proved prophetic when in February 1856, he himself vanished just 6 months before Thornfield. His medical bag was found floating in Charleston Harbor, accompanied by a note claiming his depression had led him to suicide. But those who knew him found this explanation implausible. Steinberg had been a man of deep faith and strong moral convictions, often speaking of his duty to serve those abandoned by society. His disappearance remained unsolved, deepening the mystery surrounding Charleston's dark underbelly. Then the final piece of the puzzle emerged in the most unexpected way through the conscience of a dying man who had carried the terrible knowledge for nearly half a century. In the winter of 1901, 45 years after Thornfield's disappearance, Samuel Fletcher lay on his deathbed in a Charleston charity ward, ravaged by tuberculosis and a guilt that had consumed him for decades. Fletcher had served as a night watchman at the old slave market during the 1850s, a position that gave him access to parts of the building that most people never saw and made him a witness to horrors that no Christian soul should endure. As death approached, Fletcher summoned Father Patrick McGrath, a priest who ministered to Charleston's poor and dispossessed and confessed the dark secrets that had poisoned his life. Father Fletcher wheezed, his voice faint above the rattle in his chest and the moans of the dying. "I've got to tell someone before I meet my maker. I've been carrying the devil's own secrets, and it's time for the truth to see the light of day, even if it damns me in the telling." What Fletcher revealed shattered any remaining illusions about Thornfield's disappearance, exposing a conspiracy so vast and evil that it had corrupted some of the most powerful families in the South. According to Fletcher's deathbed confession, Thornfield had not vanished mysteriously. He had died by his own hand in a ritual designed to cement his followers' loyalty and bind their souls to his through an act of spiritual corruption. Over the course of 3 nights, Fletcher revealed how, in the summer of 1855, Dr. Rutledge had approached him with an offer too good to refuse. Fletcher was paid $50 a month, a substantial sum at the time, to provide access to the slave market's underground storage areas during the night and ensure that no one saw the activities that took place there. Initially, Fletcher believed he was merely assisting in illegal slave trading, which, while morally wrong, was common enough that he could justify his involvement with a generous payment. But what he witnessed was far worse than anything he could have imagined. Between 1855 and 1856, Fletcher became an unwilling witness to the systematic torture and murder of at least 37 victims in the chambers beneath the slave market. The killings followed an elaborate ritual pattern that grew more complex and horrifying with each ceremony. The participants, dressed in black robes and masks, concealed their identities. But Fletcher's role as a watchman required him to unlock the building for their arrival, and he began to recognize several by their voices, mannerisms, and physical traits. Dr. Rutledge, identifiable by his medical bag, would check each victim's pulse before and after the rituals. Judge Crenshaw carried a leather portfolio with legal documents related to each victim. Cornelius Fitzhugh always arrived with a wooden case containing the ceremonial implements used in the killings. But it was Thornfield who orchestrated the ceremonies, directing them with the precision of a master conductor. He would arrive last, dressed in elaborate robes bearing symbols Fletcher had never seen, holding a leather-bound book from which he read incantations in languages that seemed to make the very air tremble with malevolent power. Fletcher's confession exposed not just the extent of Thornfield's crimes, but the monstrous purpose behind them. Each killing was a step in a ritual designed to bind the participants to Thornfield and to a darker power that reached far beyond human understanding. The guilt that had poisoned Fletcher's soul for nearly 5 decades was now laid bare, and the full extent of the evil that had infected Charleston's elite was revealed in horrifying detail. The rituals Fletcher described were beyond comprehension in their cruelty and spiritual perversion. Each victim was carefully prepared according to specific instructions from Thornfield's ceremonial book. Some were kept alive for days, tortured systematically, while others were killed quickly, their wounds inflicted in precise patterns, dictated by the dark scripture guiding the covenant's actions. They wasn't just killing them. Fletcher gasped to Father McGrath, his eyes wide with remembered horror. They was harvesting something from them, something that weren't blood or flesh, but something deeper. Something that made the very air in them chambers feel thick with evil. Thornfield stood at the center of each ritual, directing the others with the authority of a high priest. As each victim died, Thornfield would collect their blood in silver chalices and force the covenant members to drink further, binding them to the dark force driving their actions. But the ceremony, on the night of August 23, 1856, was unlike the others in ways that still made Fletcher tremble even after 45 years. Instead of bringing in an outside victim, Thornfield himself became the culminating sacrifice of the covenant's unholy rites. Rather than being killed against his will, Thornfield had orchestrated his own death as the final act of the dark drama he had masterminded for 2 years. Standing at the altar made of the bones of previous victims, he delivered what Fletcher could only describe as a sermon, an unholy perversion of Christian theology that promised his followers power over life and death in Charleston, but only if they completed the ritual exactly as he commanded. He told them, Fletcher whispered, his voice growing weaker, the devil's, that his sacrifice would bind their souls to his for all eternity. Said his death would give them dominion over Charleston's spiritual and temporal power, but only if they was willing to take up the knife themselves and send him to whatever master he served. Fletcher watched in horror as the 12 remaining covenant members took turns driving the ceremonial dagger into Thornfield's heart, each thrust accompanied by words in a strange language that made the chambers tremble with supernatural force. But rather than cry out in pain or fear, Thornfield smiled, his eyes fixed on something beyond the physical world, his face filled with unholy joy. His final words, as his lifeblood drained onto the altar of human bones, were a chilling promise. Through my death, you achieve immortality. Through my sacrifice, you transcend the laws of God and man. We are bound now by blood and darkness until the end of time itself. Afterward, the remaining members of the covenant disposed of Thornfield's body, placing it at the center of the other victims and arranging the corpses in a pattern Fletcher recognized from the symbols carved into the chamber walls. The members then scattered, never to meet again, but forever bound by the bloodshed, sacrilege, and spiritual corruption Thornfield had led them into. Fletcher had hidden a journal in the walls of his tenement apartment. After his death, Father McGrath recovered it. The journal contained detailed accounts of the ceremonies Fletcher had witnessed, written in a shaky hand, reflecting his limited education, but filled with absolute terror. The entries included names of victims, descriptions of ritual implements, and most damning of all, the real names of all 13 participants in the covenant. Father McGrath now faced an agonizing choice. Fletcher's journal lay before him like evidence of humanity's capacity for the ultimate evil. He could expose the truth, destroying the reputations of families whose descendants still wielded enormous power in Charleston and beyond. Or he could preserve the fragile peace, allowing the dead to keep their dark secrets buried with their bones. The implications of Fletcher's revelations rippled far beyond Charleston city limits, reaching deep into the powerful families whose legacies were forever tainted by their participation in the Covenant of Solomon. Senator Barnwell's descendants had built a political dynasty that spanned governors, congressmen, and federal judges. The Rutledge family had parlayed Dr. Edmund Rutledge's medical fortune into one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the South. Judge Crenshaw's legal legacy influenced South Carolina's constitution and judicial precedents, shaping the state's courts for generations. After 3 sleepless nights of prayer and contemplation, Father McGrath chose a path that balanced both justice and mercy while protecting the innocent descendants from the sins of their ancestors. He turned Fletcher's journal over to the Catholic Church's archives in Baltimore with instructions to seal it for 50 years. But Father McGrath also quietly launched his own investigation, using church connections throughout the South to trace the fates of the Covenant survivors and their descendants. What he discovered over the following decade confirmed Fletcher's most disturbing claims and revealed that Thornfield's final promise had been fulfilled in ways that transcended rational explanation. The families of the 12 Covenant members had indeed prospered far beyond any reasonable expectation following Thornfield's death. But their success came at a price, one that proved far more terrible than any material gain could justify. The Rutledge family, for example, had turned Dr. Edmund's medical practice into vast real estate holdings, pharmaceutical investments, and financial interests, making them one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina. But with prosperity came a hereditary curse of guilt and madness that plagued every generation. Suicide rates among Rutledge descendants were nearly 10 times the national average, with family members dying at ages corresponding exactly to significant dates in the Covenant's ritual calendar. Judge Crenshaw's sons had built a legal dynasty that dominated South Carolina politics for 3 generations, producing governors, senators, and Supreme Court justices. Yet their family line was plagued by alcoholism, mental illness, and early unexplained deaths that doctors could never fully explain. Records showed that Crenshaw descendants frequently died on August 23rd, the anniversary of Thornfield's sacrifice. The Fitzhugh tobacco fortune had grown into one of the largest mercantile empires in the South, with business interests spanning Charleston, Liverpool, and Hong Kong. But the family's success was overshadowed by a disturbing pattern of mysterious disappearances. Fitzhugh descendants would simply vanish without explanation, usually around their 30th birthday, leaving behind thriving businesses and families. The reasons for their sudden disappearances were never clear, though whispers suggested that their fates had been sealed long before their birth. More disturbingly, the private papers and diaries of Covenant descendants revealed a pattern of inherited guilt and terror, as though the curse passed from parent to child like a genetic disease. Even those who had never been told the truth about their ancestors' crimes experienced nightmares of underground chambers and bloody altars. They developed an inexplicable terror on August 23rd each year, often suffering violent illness or psychological breaks that required medical intervention. Reports from family physicians further confirmed the spiritual trauma that plagued the Covenant descendants. Dr. James Morrison, who had served as the Rutledge family physician for 40 years, noted in his confidential medical records that each member of the family displayed identical symptoms of what he termed hereditary spiritual trauma. They suffered night terrors from early childhood, experienced hallucinations involving religious imagery, and exhibited an abnormal fear of churches and religious ceremonies. It is as though the family bloodline carries within it Some form of spiritual poison, Dr. Morrison wrote in his private notes. The symptoms are too consistent and too specific to be explained by normal medical science. I have begun to suspect that certain sins create wounds in the human soul, wounds that can be passed from parent to child, like any other inherited trait. Father McGrath, upon reading these records and reviewing the evidence from his own investigation, found himself facing a moral dilemma more complex than he could have ever imagined. The curse of the covenant, he realized, was not just a legacy of wealth and power. It was a curse of the soul passed down through generations, each one more tormented than the last. And as the years wore on, the question remained: was there any way to break the chain to free the descendants of these families from the spiritual poison that had bound them to their ancestors' crimes? Or was the damage irreversible? Their souls forever entwined with the darkness Thornfield had unleashed. By 1910, several of the original Covenant family lines had died out entirely. Their last descendants either committed suicide, disappeared mysteriously, or died young from illnesses that physicians could not diagnose or treat. Those that survived did so only by leaving Charleston, changing their names, and attempting to escape the spiritual chains that bound them to Thornfield's dark legacy. The truth about Reverend Elias Thornfield's disappearance died with the last of the Covenant's direct descendants in the 1920s. However, the evidence of their crimes remains sealed in archives across the country, awaiting future generations to uncover. The chambers beneath Charleston's municipal building were never fully excavated. They remain buried under tons of concrete, locked away in the weight of deliberate forgetting. But the spiritual corruption Thornfield unleashed on Charleston did not die with the Covenant. Father McGrath's investigation revealed that the pattern of disappearances among the city's vulnerable populations had continued sporadically throughout the decades following 1856. This suggested that Thornfield's methods had inspired imitators, or that some aspect of his dark work had achieved the immortality he had promised. Modern Charleston tourists visiting the municipal building often report strange experiences. Cold spots move through the structure like invisible presences. The sound of voices speaking in unknown languages rises from beneath the floors. And most disturbing of all, there is the overwhelming sense that something malevolent watches from the shadows, hungry for the kind of spiritual corruption that once fed on the souls of the innocent. Security guards working the night shift have reported hearing what sounds like ceremonial chanting from the basement levels. Several guards have quit after experiencing waking nightmares, including visions of robed figures conducting rituals in underground chambers and the screams of victims echoing through empty halls. The presence of an evil so pure and focused that it seems to drain the very life from the air is palpable. On humid August nights, when the air hangs heavy over Charleston's historic district like a funeral shroud, residents report strange sounds emanating from beneath the municipal building. The echo of voices raised in unnatural prayer, the scrape of metal on stone as if ceremonial daggers are being sharpened for unholy work. And most disturbing of all, the sound of laughter that seems to rise from the depths of hell itself. It's as though Elias Thornfield still conducts his dark symphony from whatever realm claims the souls of those who traded their humanity for temporal power. This mystery serves as a stark reminder of how the pursuit of power and the corruption of faith can create evils that echo through generations, poisoning entire bloodlines with inherited guilt and supernatural terror. The true horror of Thornfield's covenant was not just the murders they committed or the innocent lives they destroyed, but the spiritual darkness they unleashed on their descendants, binding future generations to sins they never committed and creating a legacy of madness and death that proved more enduring than any material wealth they had gained. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there darker secrets still buried beneath Charleston's genteel facade? Have you ever experienced something unexplainable in a historic building? It left you wondering what tragedies might have occurred there decades or centuries ago? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts on what really happened in those underground chambers. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves mysteries. The past never truly dies. It just waits for the right moment to claw its way back to the surface, reminding us that some sins are too great to be forgiven, and some evils are too pure to ever truly die. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another dark chapter from America's hidden history.